Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm Lance Smith, your host, and this is episode 265. Today's alleged contradiction is one of those passages that skeptics love to put on social media because, at first glance, it sounds pretty funny. According to Matthew's account, chapter 21, verses 1 to 9, of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, some critics claim Jesus was somehow riding two animals at the same time, a donkey and its colt. Now, I don't know about you, but every time I hear that objection, I picture Jesus entering Jerusalem like a circus performer at the county fair. 1 foot on a donkey, 1 foot on a colt, balancing his way down the road while the crowd waves palm branches. Maybe throw in a cowboy hat and a loud "Yee-haw!" and you've got the skeptic's version of Palm Sunday. Of course, that's not what happened at all. And once we actually read the accounts carefully, this turns out to be one of the easiest gospel contradictions to resolve. In fact, by the time we're done, I think you'll see that all four gospel accounts actually fit together beautifully. As always, let's begin with the text. I prefer the New Living Translation. Matthew 21, 1-7 tells us this: "As soon as you enter it, you will see a donkey tied there, with its colt beside it. Untie them both and bring them to me." A few verses later we read, "They bring the donkey and the colt to him, and threw their garments over the colt, and he sat on them." Now, that's where the objection comes from. Skeptics point to that phrase, "he sat on them," and claim Matthew is describing Jesus riding two animals simultaneously. Meanwhile, Mark, Luke, and John only mention one animal. Mark 11:7 says, "They brought the colt to Jesus and threw their garments over it, and he sat on it." Luke says essentially the same thing. John 12:14 simply says, "Jesus found a young donkey and rode on it." So which is it, one donkey or two? The answer is both, but not in the way the skeptics suggest. Matthew tells us there were two animals present, the mother donkey and her colt. Mark, Luke, and John focus only on the colt because that's the animal Jesus actually rode. Those statements aren't contradictory any more than four people describing the same family vacation. Imagine your family drives to Florida. One person says, "We drove our SUV." Another says, "We took the SUV and pulled a trailer." A third says, "The kids rode in the SUV." Nobody thinks those accounts contradict each other. One person simply included more details. That's exactly what's happening here. Matthew is giving the fuller picture. The others are focusing on the main detail. In his article, "A Donkey and Her Colt," Eric Lyons of Apologetics Press points out something important. Mark, Luke, and John never say there was only one animal. They simply mention the colt because that's the animal Jesus rode. That's a huge distinction. Omitting a detail is not the same thing as denying a detail. We run into that mistake all the time when people discuss Bible contradictions. If I tell someone I went to dinner with my boss, I haven't denied that my coworkers were there too. I'm simply focused on the most important person in the story. The gospel writers do that all the time. But what about Matthew's statement that Jesus sat on them? This is where grammar becomes important. The disciples had just placed their garments on the animals. The phrase, "he sat on them," naturally refers to the garments rather than the animals themselves. In other words, Jesus sat on the cloaks that had been spread over the colt. Wayne Coppins addresses this issue in his paper, "Sitting on Two Asses." And a quick aside, scholars seem unusually comfortable putting that word into journal article titles. Coppins notes that the language simply doesn't require the bizarre image skeptics often imagine. Frankly, common sense helps here too. No serious commentator thinks Jesus was straddling two separate animals while riding into Jerusalem. That interpretation creates far more problems than it solves. I mean, have you ever tried standing on two moving objects at the same time? Most of us would struggle to stand on two skateboards in the driveway, much less ride two donkeys through a crowded city street. In fact, one scholar complained that this interpretation turns Matthew's account into what he called a circus spectacle. That's probably a little harsh, but you can see his point. Nobody reading this passage should picture Jesus performing an ancient version of a rodeo stunt. Besides, if Jesus had actually ridden into Jerusalem standing on two donkeys at once, I suspect somebody would have mentioned that detail. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, somebody would have said, and by the way, it was one of the most impressive things we've ever seen. The image is so absurd that it should immediately make us pause and ask whether we're reading the passage correctly. But there's an even bigger reason Matthew mentions both animals. Matthew is intensely interested in showing how Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. In fact, Matthew immediately quotes Zechariah 9:9. "Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious. Yet he is humble, riding on a donkey, riding on a donkey's colt." Now, in Hebrew poetry, it's common to repeat an idea in parallel form. The second line often restates the first line using slightly different words. Think of it like a songwriter repeating the same thought in a chorus for emphasis, or like a preacher saying, "God is faithful. Yes, God can be trusted." Two statements, one idea. Zechariah is not predicting two separate rides. He's describing one humble king riding a donkey's colt. Yet, Matthew includes both animals because both were actually present, which highlights the fulfillment beautifully. Scholar S.C. Carlson argues in his Catholic Biblical Quarterly article that Matthew is carefully reading Zechariah's prophecy and drawing attention to details that help his Jewish audience see Jesus as the promised Messiah. And here's an interesting detail. Scholars point out that pilgrims normally walk the final stretch into Jerusalem. Jesus deliberately chose to ride into the city, which would have immediately drawn attention to the messianic symbolism of Zechariah's prophecy. This wasn't just transportation, it was a public declaration. Matthew isn't creating a contradiction, he's emphasizing fulfillment. And that's a theme we see throughout his gospel. Another practical question is this: why bring the mother donkey at all? Actually, that makes perfect sense. Mark and Luke specifically tell us the colt had never been ridden. If you've ever been around horses, donkeys, or really any young animal, you know that's significant. An untrained animal can be nervous. Now, imagine taking that young colt into a city packed with Passover pilgrims. People are shouting, palm branches are waving, children are running around. The crowd is crying out, "Hosanna!" That's enough to make a seasoned animal uneasy. Bringing the mother donkey along would have helped keep the colt calm. It's a little like taking a nervous first grader to school on the first day and letting mom walk beside them. The colt has confidence because the mother is nearby. Several commentators make this observation, including the article from Compelling Truth, which notes the practical wisdom of having the mother accompany the colt. The article from Essential Church makes another helpful point. It addresses Bart Ehrman's discussion of the passage, Ehrman being one of the most well-known skeptical New Testament scholars today, and shows that Matthew simply provides more information than the other gospel writers. That's not unusual. Eyewitnesses regularly emphasize different details. In fact, if every witness told a story with exactly the same wording and exactly the same details, investigators would become suspicious. Independent witnesses naturally remember and emphasize different aspects of an event. The article, Did Jesus Ride into Jerusalem on One Donkey or Two? From Reluctant Christian, makes the same observation. The gospel writers are not copying one another word for word here. They're highlighting different aspects of the same historical event, and that's exactly what we'd expect to find from authentic testimony. One source I found especially interesting was Catherine Sider Hamilton's commentary for Working Preacher. She notes that Matthew's inclusion of both animals may also echo messianic themes reaching back to Genesis 49, where Judah's future king is connected with a donkey and a colt. Interestingly, this isn't just a connection modern scholars have noticed. Jewish interpreters had long associated Genesis 49 and Zechariah 9 with messianic expectations, making Matthew's emphasis on the donkey and colt even more meaningful to his original audience. In other words, Matthew isn't merely recording transportation details. He's painting a theological portrait. He's showing Jesus as the long-awaited Son of David, the promised king entering his city in humility. And that brings us back to the Skeptic's Annotated Bible, which lists this passage as a contradiction because Matthew mentions two animals, while Mark, Luke, and John mention only one. But notice what's missing. None of the other gospel writers ever say there was only one animal present. And Matthew never says Jesus rode both animals. The alleged contradiction only appears if we add words that aren't actually in the text. The moment we read the accounts carefully and let each writer speak for himself, the problem disappears. In fact, instead of conflicting, these accounts fit together exactly the way we'd expect independent eyewitness accounts to fit together. Matthew gives us additional detail. Mark, Luke, and John focus on the central action. Put them together, and we get a richer picture of what happened on that first Palm Sunday. So, when someone asks, did Jesus ride one donkey or two? The answer is simple. Two animals were present. One animal was ridden, and no contradiction exists. The real lesson here is that many alleged Bible contradictions fall apart once we slow down and read carefully. Sometimes the Bible needs a little less skepticism and a little more observation. If today's episode helped strengthen your faith or gave you the tools to answer someone else's questions, I'd encourage you to share it with a friend. You can support the podcast at buymeacoffee.com/Lance Smith. Always appreciated, never expected. Every episode is available at BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com. You can also find us on the Bible Difficulties and Answers Facebook page. Or send me an email at BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com. I read every message that comes in. This is Lance Smith, wishing you good health, good study, and God's richest blessings. We'll see you next time. So long, everybody.